Okay, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to address this audience. It's difficult to be the last speaker, and after such two dynamic speakers. My pleasure is also somewhat mitigated, I should say. We had envisaged Rania Antonopoulos, the Greek employment minister, was actually invited and scheduled to speak, and she's had to drop out at fairly short notice for reasons I guess you can probably imagine. Nevertheless, I think what I was originally going to present in another session fits in here. I hope that in this late hour I can convince you that monetary financing of public investment may offer a sort of candle in the wind of some of the gloom that we've heard. I think it perhaps complements also a little bit what Özlem said. So let me start straight away. Start with the overview here. I want to explain a little bit why I think this topic is important, why we need to focus on monetary financing and examine its possibilities. Have a little look at the theory of monetary financing and the debates that have happened in recent years, particularly with reference to the euro area. And then I'm going to make a short, concrete proposal and also flag up some issues and questions that I think are certainly in my mind still not resolved. So some preliminary remarks. I'm going to use this acronym here, COMFOP. It stands for Conditional Overt Monetary Financing of Public Investment. So it's just a name given to one particular way of organizing monetary financing in the context of the euro area. And as I will mention, there are some other alternatives, including one mentioned perhaps when he was in a less gloomy moment by Mark Blythe himself. There is a working paper out. You have the link here. It's a little bit dated now. It needs to be updated. I hope to get some feedback also from this conference and from some other presentations and do that. A couple of sort of caveats first. I mean, this is just one policy area. Özlem presented a whole range of policies. I think this would fit in, and it's certainly not contradictory to some of the ideas that she's presented, and also to some of the ideas that have been discussed in the context of this conference. For example, the Euro Treasury idea that Jörg Bibo presented, or some other ideas. Okay, so why would we even want to consider monetary financing? I mean, I think you need to believe, if you like, you need to buy into, more or less into these 5 propositions to, as it were, give a hearing to the idea of monetary financing. But I suspect that certainly in this room, and I think more widely, these propositions are not particularly controversial. So the first is obviously that we have an aggregate demand problem in the euro area. The second is a sort of double header on monetary policy, that we've run out of road, as it were, in terms of the use of monetary policy, conventional monetary policy. I think that's fairly obvious. The issue is a little bit whether QE on its own, in the way that it's being organized at the moment, whether it can solve the aggregate demand problem in the euro area, and or B, if it's not possibly able to do that, but at the risk of blowing up bubbles, of promoting also a very distributionally unbalanced growth model along the lines of the one that we've seen here and has been criticized by the previous speaker. The fourth point is that fiscal policy on its own is hamstrung by European and national rules. Again, we've had quite a few sessions on this in the course of this conference, and I don't go into details here, but you're familiar with the whole debate about the Stability and Growth Pact, the Fiscal Compact, the debt breaks that are now in many national legislative frameworks and indeed constitutions at the European level. And in particular, I would argue, I mean, there is one country, it's actually the country we're all in at the moment, which would have some fiscal space even under the rules, the existing rules that we have. The problem is that that country is not, it seems, willing really to make use of that fiscal space in the interests of getting the European economy going. And last but not least, I think this is an important point, although I won't say very much about it now. I mean, I think a lot of the debate we're having seems to be, couched in the terms of, how can we get out of the recession we're in? How can we avoid a breakup of the euro area, right? And my interpretation is that we've really diminished our expectations of what we actually want to happen in Europe. We do have a Europe 2020 strategy that's all about, a forward-looking Europe that's wealthy, that has inclusive growth, that is ecologically sustainable. And really, I think that's what we really should be focusing on. And we need to get out of this crisis management mode. So even if, arguably with some tweaks to fiscal and monetary policy, we can get out of the crisis, I would argue that if we want to go further, if we want to have sustained and stable growth, we need to at least consider this option of monetary financing. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to skip the next 4 slides. Basically, these slides just amplify these points here. I'm going to take it, as it were, as read, that the sort of general agreement, or at least a suspension of disbelief, and that on the basis of these principles, I can go and not spend too much time on these preliminary issues. I discussed the scope for actually, doing something within the current fiscal framework and the monetary framework, but I'm going to skip over those in the interests of time. Okay, so I've used this term monetary financing several times already. It's about time to say exactly what it is, although I'm sure most of you will be familiar with it. It's essentially the creation of base money by the central bank to finance expansionary fiscal policy. That's a fairly generic definition. It's often associated with this idea of helicopter money, in which, in this sort of thought experiment that goes back to Friedman, the expansionary fiscal policy came in the form of throwing banknotes out of a helicopter, hence helicopter money. But in fact, in a more realistic and modern conception, the base money enters into the stream of goods and services production in one of 3 ways. Essentially, one is through tax cuts. The other is through transfers to the public, and the other, and that's the one I'll be considering, is through financing public investment. I have a discussion in the paper about a little bit of the sort of historical overview. I won't go into that here. I mean, the point is that the strict division we have now, essentially between fiscal and monetary policy, is actually a product of fairly recent times. It was not the case in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it was essentially established, as a result of what was seen as unsustainable inflationary trends in the 1970s. Again, I won't go into that here. But what I would emphasize is that we're in a situation until comparatively recently when, and I'm quoting here Adair Turner, the former head of the Financial Services Authority in the UK, amongst other things, that monetary financing was seen as a taboo. And in that context, he cited here the president of a quite well-known central bank, who said that to print money to finance deficits indeed has the status of a mortal sin, the work of the devil, as much as a technical error. So as a indication of the opprobrium which was sort of heaped on anybody who suggested that it was the task of the central bank, or useful for the central bank, to sort of print money and hand it out to the government to finance expansionary fiscal policy. Now, that has changed somewhat, and essentially I think that's due to Japan, if I can just put it in one word. I mentioned this in the plenary session we had yesterday when we were discussing Japan, and there was a quite famous speech in this literature made by Ben Bernanke in 2003 in Japan, when he basically said that Japanese central bank had tried on its own to get out of the deflationary trap. The Japanese fiscal authorities had also tried, and what was necessary was, in fact, a form of monetary financing to finally break out of that trap. And what transpired also from the meeting yesterday was that Bernanke was perhaps he's big in this subsequent literature, because many people now refer to him, but he wasn't big in Japan, to quote a popular song, at the time, because his advice was essentially ignored. And I've flagged up here a number of authors who have dealt now in trying to draw some lessons from the Japanese experience, have dealt on these issues thrown up by Bernanke and doubtless also by others, including some fairly famous people associated more or less with, if you might call them as a progressive mainstream, people who are taking different angles have examined this idea of monetary financing, including, I should mention, on the policy side, Mark Blythe, as I mentioned before, and also Stefan Eder, I've seen at this conference. I think is still in the audience here, quite with a recent contribution. So I'm going to sum up some of the very key conclusions from this literature as I see it, and this is, having gone through this literature, is what I used to design the proposal, and I would put up 4 very key findings from the literature. One is actually, sounds banal, but it's effective, right? Monetary financing works in the sense of raising nominal GDP and thus allowing public debt ratios to decline. So it can and it should be implemented when other methods fail, for reasons I'll explain. It's seen often in the literature as a bit of a last resort when you've tried other things that haven't worked. But then, if you're in that situation, the consensus in the literature seems to be then you should implement monetary financing. It can also be argued that it can be deployed before it's a last resort, because it's actually more effective than other policies, notably than QE in the form it's being implemented at the moment for distributional and other reasons. But, and this is the point about the last resort, there are risks associated with monetary financing. Monetary financing is not something that one would want to go into, in a normal situation. And these are the risks, basically, that go back to the debate of the implications of the 1970s. Some other points from the literature that in the sort of popular imagination, sort of the implied losses for the central bank of this money creation, are highly problematic. In fact, they're not, as shown by the literature. They can also arise in the context of standard QE. In fact, and again, this point was made very clearly by Bernanke, there is a sort of cost to monetary financing, if you like, but it's inflation. It creates inflation. Normally, you don't want to create inflation. Normally, inflation, is essentially a loss in real terms to all people holding money and earning money. It's just that in this particular case, in the situation we're in at the moment, where we're actually desperately trying to increase the rate of inflation, that obviously the policy would not be costly. In that sense, it will be costless, or there's some sort of double dividend from this. So the decisive issue, I think, at least that's what I tried to build my idea around, is this idea of monetary dominance versus fiscal dominance. So the emphasis made by Bernanke was on the fact that if the Bank of Japan and the finance ministry engage in a sort of strategic partnership, what is important is that it's the central bank that, in line with its mandate, once a certain rate of inflation is reached, that it can then end the monetary financing. So there's monetary domination rather than fiscal domination. Anyway, we can discuss that. That's certainly how I've tried to set this thing up. I think I'll skip the last point. So before I show you what the proposal looks like, I just delve a little bit into this idea about why use public investment as a vehicle and not use one of the other methods for linking monetary policy to expansionary fiscal policy. Let me first of all say I'm not against using the other methods. I think there are reasons why one would like to focus on public investment. One is that also, as we've seen, there has been a very substantial decline in public investment and the capital stock in a number of countries, notably here in Germany. As Sebastian Gechert and other people have shown, there are high multipliers normally associated with public investment as opposed to other forms of expansionary fiscal policy. You're definitely getting as a one-for-one, at least, expenditure on real goods and services. And I think going back to the point about a more, changing the growth model in the medium term, also as Özlem has indicated, public investment can be an important element of that. There are other proposals out there. Indeed, perhaps Mark will come back in the debate about his own proposal to use transfers. Civazzi and Tabellini have recommended tax cuts. I think there are probably some drawbacks to those things, certainly to tax cuts in distributional terms. But I think the key point for me will be that the multipliers are probably going to be lower. But again, we can come back to that. Okay, so this is what this proposal, conditional overt monetary financing of public investment, looks like. So the conditional is essentially this C is expressing this idea of monetary dominance, if you like, conditional on, it's in operation as long as the central bank feels it's necessary to get back essentially onto the inflation target. So there's a diagram here. I'm going to flip a little bit between the text perhaps and the, or let me actually go to the diagram. I don't know. I hope you can see it reasonably clearly. This is a little bit, I should point out, a little bit different to the diagram that's in the paper. But essentially, it uses existing institutions. It uses here the European Investment Bank. The European Investment Bank issues bonds, which are initially sold on the primary market. They're purchased by the ECB on the secondary market. You know that the ECB is not allowed to purchase government and sort of quasi-government debt like the EIB debt on the primary market. The resources are transferred to accumulate then with the monetary resources with the EIB. It's passed on to the member states as investment funding. The member states here make the public investment projects. Again, we'll come back to the details in a second, which has effects on the real economy. The ECB is sort of monitoring the real economy and also price trends, and essentially decides, when enough of this process has gone on. The dotted, not the dotted lines, what are they called? The dashed lines, sort of indicate that there can be debt servicing payments in this proposal. It depends a little bit exactly how you set it up. But if the EIB essentially gives the money to the member states as a loan, and I'm informed that EIB loans are not counted under the Maastricht criteria as public debt, then they're essentially serviced via back to the EIB, which obviously must pass on this debt servicing monies to the ECB, which is holding the bonds. But because the ECB profits are essentially returned to the member states, you're getting a sort of fictional debt servicing circle, which I've tried, perhaps not very cleverly, but I've tried to portray here. And that's essentially, a sort of zero-sum game ultimately. The fact is that you've got money creation on the one hand, and you've got expansionary fiscal policy on the other. I think that I've more or less said. Yeah, perhaps just a word on the investment projects. So, I mean, you'll be aware that there's this Juncker plan, for example, at the moment where member states are already, submitting lists to the European authorities of suitable investment projects. I mean, I think the key issue would be to have, a fairly simple set of criteria. One could use the goals of the Europe 2020 strategy as a guideline for the sort of projects that, are entitled to funding by this by this scheme. In my original conception, there's no need to have co-finance for these projects. Again, I discussed this with some people at the Commission. I mean, they said, well, perhaps you should insist on some sort of co-financing. Again, that's à discuter, as they say in Brussels. I mean, these are all essentially details of the schemes. Obviously, if you don't have co-financing, you get, it's easier certainly for the countries in fiscal difficulties at the moment to get on with financing public investment as quickly as possible. Okay, so again, these are the numbers I've taken now from the original paper. I mean, when I was working on that, there was no QE program, and now there is. You might want to consider, the implications now that we're already involved in a QE program. I mean, in my original idea, I was talking about, a digressive package over 5 years, 750 billion euros in total. Of bonds issued, the ECB commitment being to purchase these bonds on the secondary market as part of their QE project, up to the point where they felt that inflation was on target. I think in the paper I suggested, when the core inflation rate had perhaps risen and had gone a bit over 2%, perhaps you could say it's over I don't know 2.5%, 2.25%, perhaps for 3 months on the run. Then the ECB could say, okay, we stop buying the bonds. But essentially again the choice of this precise target is a technical issue, and you can do it in different ways. I mean, I thought a little bit about how you can, sort of carve up this thing. Obviously, the simplest sort of intellectually and also the simplest politically is probably just simply to do it all on the basis of the ECB capital key. That will be along the lines also of what Jörg Bibo also here today has proposed with his Euro Treasury idea, which I think in some ways is a little bit similar to this idea, or perhaps you could say it's a sort of functional equivalent of this idea. So you would just offer governments the funding based on this capital key. You could think about other ways, but then you're starting to bring in sort of redistributional issues, cross-border redistributional issues. If you distributed it by population, of course, you would sort of benefit the lower income countries somewhat over proportionally. You could concentrate the spending or the project, the financing, on the crisis countries. But again, you're probably then really going to get into the sort of difficulties that Jörg also emphasizes, that one wants to avoid. That you're going to get people in the wealthier countries, notably here in Germany, protesting against this sort of fiscal federalism, this socialization of European debt. So there's a number of things to think about. I mean, this is my aim was to get this out in the debate, get some feedback. I mean, one could think about what sort of forms the bond should take. What would be the best way to think about an inflation trigger for the ECB? Are there any limits to the ECB's capacity to? That'll be no problem. Any limits to the ECB's capacity to engage in this sort of financing? I mean, the idea was to use the EIB rather than create an additional institution, simply because it's there, as they say. But maybe it will be better actually to go to a dedicated institution. Right. So I can conclude now. I think what's clear is that we need both the monetary and fiscal engines in Europe to be roaring, as it were, to ensure that we get takeoff for the European economy, to escape this risk of secular stagnation, to refer back to the title of this conference, and that will ensure fiscal consolidation. At the moment, we have the monetary engine essentially going at full tilt, and the fiscal engine either not working or even going in reverse, and then we're worried. We're surprised why the plane is not in takeoff mode, but is sort of circling around and at risk of crashing all the time. We need a greater public investment for short-term, but also I would argue for medium and longer-term reasons, and we should be frank, and also the people in the national ministries and in the European institutions should be frank that something has to give, right? And of course, one will oppose this proposal with some legal issues, but somewhere we're going to have to break the rules. I think either we're going to be in this situation of long-term stagnation without really a path out. But either we're really going to have to smash the fiscal rules, or I shouldn't use the word smash, I mean radically revise the fiscal rules, along the lines of enabling, at the very least, enabling a sort of a golden rule, and at the same time, simply the willingness of surplus countries to actually engage in expansionary fiscal policy. And don't forget that means changing not only the European rules, but also now, unfortunately, a lot of national rules, which have now been, infested, I would say, with debt breaks. Or we need to make monetary financing work. I have this nice quote from Willem Boyd: "Stagnation is a policy choice." I mean, if monetary financing would be effective, then if we don't use it or don't find a way to use it, perhaps not this way, perhaps a different way, perhaps Mark Blythe's way, or perhaps a way that we still haven't come up with yet, then we're condemning Europe to stagnation, to secular stagnation, when we have a policy choice to do something else. Thank you very much.